coming up next. Stay tuned to learn more about student interest in blockchain technology. Reimagine 2020.
I'm Paul Brody. I'm the global blockchain leader at EY, and I'm delighted to be part of Reimagine 2020.
Hey everybody, it's Patrick McLain. We're back again, Reimagine 2020. We have a very interesting guest. I want to introduce you to Paul Brody, and I'll tell you why I think this is interesting. So I think a lot of people in blockchain, right? Maybe some people are speculators, maybe some people are investors. I find a smaller portion are the developers, are actually the people implementing it. And what I think is interesting, and what we're going to hear from Paul, is the perspective of, a company that he works for, and I'll let him tell you, but, how he kind of sees enterprises adopting blockchain and what those roadblocks are. What's going on behind the scenes to really make blockchain a reality. So before I butcher it anymore, Paul, I will let you introduce yourself and, tell everybody your name, your company, and, what brought you to this place, your experience, and how'd you get into blockchain?
Sure. So thanks very much, Patrick. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm Paul Brody. I'm the global blockchain leader at EY, sometimes known as Ernst & Young. We are a global professional services firm, tax, audit, legal, and business advisory services, well, practically everywhere on Earth. I am based in San Francisco. I've been here for about 5 years. Came over actually from IBM, where I built IBM's very first blockchain as part of my own interest at IBM. I was running the global electronics industry there. And I got interested in this question of, how is it that if we have all this computing power at the edge, there's more computing power in our pockets and on our desks than there is in all the world's data centers. And yet, my clients at the time were spending lots and lots of money maintaining data centers in order to manage applications that ran at the edge of the network. And that just seemed kind of crazy. It seemed to me like there was this incredible opportunity to use peer-to-peer computing to have all of this digital infrastructure at the edge of the network pay each other to manage their own products and services. And so that got me interested in the blockchain. And once I really realized how incredible this space was, I decided to make it my focus. At the time, amazingly, because IBM is well known as a big blockchain company now, they were not excited about blockchain. And that was one of the reasons why I left and I came to EY, which sort of strangely for a more than century-old accounting firm was actually quite excited about fintech, blockchain, and emerging technology. And so for the last 5 years here at EY, I've been building a global blockchain team. We have teams that pretty much everywhere in the world, all across Europe, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain. We have a security center in Israel, development center in India, delivery team in India, Philippines, Japan, China, South Korea, as well as the US and Canada and Costa Rica. So we're pretty much all over the world, and we cover business applications, tax, and audit. And we also do kind of core blockchain technology research. And our big focus over the last 4 or 5 years has been two important areas. Number one, regulatory compliance, right? It's a bit of a running joke here, but the idea is if you do business with us or we're your auditor, you are less likely to go to jail. And truth be told, most of our clients would not fare well in jail. So that's very important. I wouldn't fare well in jail. But the other thing, our other big focus is taking blockchain from this kind of niche, interesting area that people are excited about as consumers, Bitcoin users and speculators, and putting it in the hands of enterprises. We have a very, very specific vision for enterprises, which is that we think blockchain will become the tool that companies use to connect themselves up to each other. Because the truth is that the products that we buy today, the products and services we buy, they're typically not made by a single company. They're actually made by dozens or hundreds of companies working together, right? There might be one famous brand that is the orchestrator of that whole supply chain. But the truth is the products we buy are made by hundreds of companies, and they don't actually have a very good set of tools to integrate with each other. I believe blockchain is a key to doing that, and it will unlock enormous amounts of value creation for our clients. So that's a kind of a quick summary of what we do and where we think we're headed.
Got it. And one thing that I think is interesting, and I don't know, I would say I've had startups since I was a kid, right? So I've lived in kind of the startup world, maybe a little bit luckier nowadays, right? We deal with the Perkins Coie, the Coolies of the world, right? So it was only a certain time in my career path where I saw this upper echelon of whether it's consultants, legal, tax advisors, right? And I'm guessing maybe a decent amount of this audience doesn't really understand how the Ernst & Youngs, the EYs, or the McKinsey, right, the Deloittes, et cetera. And Paul's going to be like, who? He's a good, give this guy a raise, Ernst & Young. If anyone from Ernst & Young is watching, Paul needs a raise. But can you explain for the audience, in layman's terms as possible, what roles do companies like Ernst & Young, et cetera, serve to the corporate or enterprise world?
So I'll just first tell you, this for me, I think of it as my sixth startup. And, I did 5 startups, very few of which, well, none of which actually made me rich. I actually, every time, after the last couple of times, every time I'd finish a startup, I'd be like, that's it, I'm never doing this again, right? But at EY is actually offered me in the end what I think of as like the best possible combination, because startups are great. You get to build entirely new things, you get to write new rules. But the problem with startups, and having done 5 of them, I know all about the problems with startups. You go into a client and they're like, who are you? And what do you want? And if I buy something from you, will you be here even in 6 months or 2 years? Right? Can you deliver this for me in 50 different countries? The answer is almost always no. Right? Now, if I'm at the startup, I'll tell you, yes, of course, we'll travel wherever you want. But the truth is, if you're a large company and you want to deploy something at scale, if you want to deploy significant change in your business process or your core technology, there are very few large companies that do things in one country, right? They need to do things in 50 countries or 100 countries. They need to deploy them at scale. And they want to work with another company that's going to be able to support them. It's going to be around in business for decades, because that's how long software lasts, right? Y2K, the problem that we had back in Y2K came about because software developers, like my mother in the 1960s, thought, well, we don't need to put in a 4-digit date because our software will be long gone by the year 2000. We get to the, it's 1997 and like half their software is still running. That's how long stuff lasts. So large companies like to do business with other large companies because they want services and products that can be delivered globally, and they feel will be backed up and supported and last for a very long period of time. And so it's awesome, at EY, I could go to a client and say, we have bleeding edge technology. I have amazing developers. We're all up to date on the latest technology. And as one of the world's largest audit firms, I can tell you with confidence that you probably aren't going to go to prison for taking Bitcoin or payment in Ether, and we'll be able to support you all around the world. And I believe that's given us some huge and exciting advantages in terms of being able to have a big impact and bring product to market. But that's the role of big companies, and it's an important role, and it's underappreciated how large enterprises, especially consulting firms, make it possible for the rest of the world to change their business processes quickly and scalably.
Got it. Now, a question. So, we can read reports and, you can follow trend lines and say, okay, how are executives and top corporations globally thinking about blockchain, right? And I think incrementally we could see that their interest has been peaking year after year, right? They view it as maybe critical to their business in the next 5 years. They view it as, less risk, something they want to explore, maybe not devote a ton of time. And then I think on the opposite side, they maybe have some fears, right? What are the obstacles? So just from your perspective, can you give us insight into, as much as you can, like how executives are thinking about blockchain?
Yeah, absolutely. So, early on in the hype cycle, and every technology goes through hype cycles. I'm terribly, terribly old. So I can actually remember the hype cycle for the internet. I can remember being told like, wow, no one will ever buy groceries online, and things like that. So that's normal. And so you get the cynicism, then you get the hype, where people are like, oh my gosh, I have to be on the internet, I have to be on the blockchain. And with that, we had this wave of what I'll call blockchain tourism. Like people were like, I have $500,000. What kind of a blockchain can I get one? And I'm like, a purple one for you, right? And that was great. We made some money that way. But the truth is, like, blockchain tourism doesn't last, right? You know, just like back in the late 90s, putting your company on the internet, not very useful. What got people online was selling stuff on the internet. And that's when they get enterprises online too. The big obstacle in the enterprise world is blockchains are a network value proposition. So if I am Ford or GM or Microsoft or AT&T, I want to deal with hundreds of other companies, suppliers and customers. Now, I have two ways of doing that. I can build a private blockchain, but what's the point? That's like telling everybody, hey, you have to come to my private website. Whatever it is I do in my proprietary way, you have to do it. It doesn't scale very well. It's like in the old days saying, yes, we sell online, but only through dial-up on AOL, right? And hopefully most of the people watching this are too young to know what dial-up or AOL is. On the other hand, there are public blockchains. Public blockchains are very, very similar to the early days of the internet. In the very early days of the internet, there was no encryption. If I sent you an email, it literally went out in plain text, right? There was no encryption, there was no privacy, there was virtually no security, and it wasn't necessary because all the people on the internet kind of knew each other, right? Now, today, everything we do on the internet is covered in layers of encryption and verification and security software. That software was missing from public blockchains. And for most enterprises, if you came to them and said, I have this really cool thing, smart contracts allows you to manage complex process between multiple parties very efficiently, they'd be like, that sounds amazing. And then you're like, oh, by the way, though, everything you do will be completely public. They're like, nope, not happening. The number one obstacle for doing anything of value in the world of public blockchains is privacy and security. If you can't do it privately and you can't do it with security, there's really no interest from the enterprise, right? As an individual, my one little transaction of a few Ether or a couple of Bitcoin going through the network, that's probably, I don't care too much about that if somebody knows that I own a little bit of Bitcoin. But as a company, if you could see what I was buying and how much I was paying for it and where it was going, you would have access to information that would allow you to buy and sell my stock and do all kinds of stuff. So the number one obstacle, and the one that I think EY especially, we have done more than anybody else to really work on and solve, is privacy and security for transactions on public blockchains. And the reason for doing public blockchains is because if you don't do it on a public blockchain, then what's the point? If you do it on a private blockchain, all you've done is decide that some company that runs a private blockchain is your new intermediary. If you're willing to agree upon an intermediary, whatever you want to do, I can do it for less and faster with a traditional website. So if you really need something without an intermediary, if you don't want to expose your critical business information to a potential competitor, and you want to do it without an intermediary, but you need it with privacy, then you have to do it in the public blockchain, and you have to do it with something like a zero knowledge proof or some other privacy tool. And that's hard to engineer.
We're going to get along. And I think you just brought up a very interesting perspective. And, you know, something we've been working on internally and having a lot of conversations about, right? Where I think there's a general belief, I guess. And what I just heard you say, to be blunt with you, I've heard very few people say. And I'm not sure I've ever heard it brought up the way you just brought it up. So now I'm intrigued. But so, you know, I think when we think corporations or we think enterprises, I think, okay, there's very little interest for them to go to a public chain, right? And as you mentioned, it's anonymity of data, right? Like these companies are very siloed. What would it take for them, even if there's the smallest percentage chance, to make their data in any way viewed by the public, right? So the incentives are very, I think, misaligned, right? And they need to, there's this uphill battle. So then I think on the other side, and maybe it's only to a certain extent kind of the culture of blockchain, right? Where I think blockchain started as this libertarian or, right, like everybody wanted decentralization. So you have in this public forum, then you kind of get to the Ripples, the Hyperledgers, the Hedera Hashgraphs of the world, right? Where they're really employing private chains, right? Permission chains. And I think you get a little bit of blowback from the crypto community, which is, that's not blockchain, right? That's not decentralized. So there's this line in the sand, which is if it's not in a public chain, do you want to say something?
No. I just would say like, it's not religious or doctrinaire or anything like that for me. It's just, if it's not on a public blockchain, what was the point? Like, what's the value creation? I don't think there is that. We did a survey last year of 230 companies that had implemented blockchains, and almost every single blockchain tool that had been implemented was a private blockchain. The average private blockchain has 0.5 users. 0.5. That's the average private blockchain. There's no network effect there. That's completely
the adoption in Silicon Valley terms, they would get laughed out of every venture capitalist office. It would not even be the amount of money that has been raised for the low amount of adoption. It is the opposite of what we would ever expect. And maybe that's a good sign. Maybe we're on to something new and the paradigm has shifted, right? But anyways, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
no, but it's you know, you and I are very much on the same page. It's really hard for some of the people who've done this stuff to accept that private blockchains are just not that useful. And so
it's gambling. I mean, even public blockchains is gambling apps. It's like some video games. Like the actual use of public blockchains, even is small. I mean, from outside of exchanges, financial currencies, etc.
Right, and that's one of my big beefs with public blockchains is there's not enough good stuff to buy on them, right, for enterprises, right? Enterprises don't want to gamble, they don't want to speculate on a bunch of stupid initial coin offerings, right? It's the value proposition for enterprises has to be something clear. And ultimately, my goal isn't to sell enterprise a specific technology. The goal, success, always comes from selling enterprises a solution to a very specific problem. And so that's kind of our mission, that's our goal, is to solve some very specific problems. In our case, the number one priority we have for enterprises is solving this issue of how do you do a purchase or sale transaction with another company? Because everything you buy was bought by a company and assembled and integrated and shipped and moved along. So the way that most non-financial services companies interact with each other is they buy stuff. I have money, you have stuff, we're going to exchange them, subject to the terms of a contract. That is my goal, is to implement that on public chains with privacy. And if the buyer has a purchase order, which is just a commitment to purchase something, and the seller needs capital, then I want the DeFi ecosystem to be able to say, oh, that purchase order is worth money, right? And we can give you some working capital, right? I want to create the whole ecosystem that enables those business transactions. So that's the goal. It's not easy to get there because writing code without encryption is much, much simpler than writing code and systems with zero knowledge proofs, with synchronization. Like everything we do, all the actual data has to reside off chain so that you can tell a company you never have to worry about losing your secrets because your secrets never go on the blockchain. The only thing we put on the blockchain are hashes, proofs, and links, right? And that's incredibly, incredibly challenging to do, but we now know how to do it. We published a set of protocols with Microsoft and Consensus called Baseline. And if you use the Baseline protocol, you should be able to build applications and tools that run to a very high standard of privacy and security and regulatory compliance.
No, 100%. And that's kind of always my answer to people that are thinking of building on a public chain. I mean, obviously, you can obfuscate anything, right? It's just what tax you want to pay on that computation, what tax you want to pay on those public networks, right, to really execute those transactions. So, by the way, I'm really enjoying it. For anybody that's listening to this conversation right now, for the thousands of students that are listening, I'm telling you, listen to what this guy is saying. These are things that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and he's bringing up some really interesting points. And I have a few questions. So I want to get in briefly to, and I think I have a few questions based on experience, or how are enterprises or large institutions interacting with public chains. But before we get there, I would like your perspective on, so I think the industry is at risk right now based on what I'm seeing, and I'll forecast it. So when I talk, whether it's with corporations or whoever, innovation side, what I see is, and what we do with Mousebelt, for example, on our university side, as we were talking before the call, we have an education alliance for all the universities, right? So we have Stellar, Tron, Neo, Ripple, NEM, every single company in blockchain, Binance, they're all in our education alliance, right? So we're in conversations with all of them, right? So I feel like we have a unique relationship where they kind of give us some honesty. And the other half, we're talking to corporate partners. And I see a divide. Like, I think that in early 2018 through like mid 2019, a lot of these blockchain protocols, the ones that raise money through ICOs or whatever, they really, what they were lacking was validation. Like, hey, I just raised $100 million, or I'm worth $1 billion. I need to show proof, right? So they're kind of searching out these partners at scale where they can really have use cases or proof of concepts that deploy to 100 million, billion people or whatever. So I think they were trying to bend over backwards to work with these partners, right? And then I think internally at these large institutions, there's a variety of reasons or how the corporations or enterprises were approaching it, which were, okay, in some cases, maybe there was some internal evangelist, right? Or some internal cheerleader. Now, maybe that guy left, so the pilot dropped, right? Or maybe there was a consortium where one company came later than the others and their interests were as prioritized as the others, so they didn't go through with it. So I just continue to find that corporations are at this point where they're like, hey, we've played around blockchain for a year and a half. We might have done 1 to 15 pilots, maybe a few of them we cared about, like you and I talked about earlier. A lot of it seemed like it was more for PR than actual substance. And on the other half, I talked to like a lot of the protocols, and they're like, nope, we don't care anymore. We went down that path of promises of X pilot, Y pilot, right? So I do think nowadays that there's a little bit of misalignment where the protocols maybe are a bit disillusioned with the promises of scale. The enterprises they've had the evangelists, they've heard about blockchain, they haven't hit a home run yet, so they're not sure what they want to do. And then I see a lot of default back to like Hyperledger, right? So how do you view this, right? So I guess I'll prompt my question, but I have a fear that it's like everybody's just going to default to Fabric someday, if we aren't careful. And just curious to hear how you view that relationship between, public chains, permission chains, and how you see that kind of netting out.
So that's definitely not what we see. So in our survey last year of 230 companies that implemented blockchains, 75% of them said that for their next initiative, they would look to a public blockchain. And that's because if you implement the private blockchain, you figure out very quickly that getting somebody else to join your proprietary private blockchain isn't very attractive. But we are in this phase of what I'll call the valley of despair, or the trough of disillusionment. I forget what Gartner calls it, but this is a normal part of the process where the overinflated hype doesn't match up the reality, and some of the early backers who didn't maybe have a very realistic sense of what could be done, they get disillusioned and they want to move on, and that's fine. Normally, all the really big improvements and revolutionary stuff that gets done right now happens during this time when people stop paying attention. So when I went 5 years ago and I went to the EY board and I said, I want a lot of money for blockchain, right? I told them, I said, we're going to go through this phase where companies are going to say blockchains are stupid and pointless, and I give up on them, right? I said, I don't know when it's coming, but it's coming sometime in the next few years. We're here. And this is entirely what we expected. And I'm actually
especially as everybody's budgets get cut right now. Right now, it's like it's on the chopping block. Like
it always happens. It's totally predictable. I've been through a few kind of recessions, from the tech bust in 2001 to the global financial crisis. It never stops technology adoption. It temporarily cuts budgets. It makes people more realistic, but it never stops the end game. So I remain extremely optimistic, right? And I actually feel more positive than ever, particularly about public blockchains, right? A year ago, 18 months ago, I'll give you a sense of how much progress has been made. 18 months ago, we debuted our very first private transaction technology on the public Ethereum network. And we needed $100 in gas to execute it because it used so much computation power. 6 months after that, we debuted our first version, production version, and we've gotten that $100 down to about $10. In December of last year, we had it down to 5 cents. So in about 18 months, we went from $100 a transaction for a private, secure, public blockchain transaction to 5 cents. Since then, we've added regulatory compliance, business logic, and a whole set of tools around that to enable full enterprise transactions. So in about 24 months, we've gone from this is our aspiration to you can set up and run a procurement process for your enterprise in about 2 days on a blockchain. So I feel incredibly optimistic about public blockchains. I can do business transactions that are as secure and as private as anything in any private blockchain, and I can do them for clients for 99% less than whatever anything on a private blockchain costs you today.
We're gonna talk later. I have a few clients for you. And I want to kind of switch gears here, but this part really intrigues me because I won't even pretend to say that I have as much exposure. I have my own little bubble of it, but I have some of my own theories. How do you think the collaboration or when Ernst & Young has a client wants a solution, you devise a solution or propose a solution, how do you guys look at public blockchains? How does that relationship look like between the public blockchain and the private partner? What does that flow? I mean, is it pretty amicable right now? No, I mean, would you say that the public blockchains are rushing? Like you come to them and say, I have a client and you can debut your technology at this scale. Are the public blockchains primarily interested in showing off their technology? Are they interested in turning a profit? Are they interested in validation? What are kind of their ends of the motivation?
So we only work on one public blockchain in terms of application development. So from an audit and tax perspective, we will support everything: Hyperledger, Ripple, Hashgraph, you name it. If you do business on it and we're your auditor, we will audit you. But when it comes to application development, we only develop on Ethereum. And the reason we only develop on Ethereum is it's the only platform that offers you a private blockchain environment if you really, really want to go private, and a public one. And we know how to do a migration from one to the other over time. In terms of our collaboration with Ethereum, I would say, yes, we were regarded as a kind of big corporation with some level of suspicion a couple of years ago. But as we have started to pour tons of code and effort into the public domain, all of our code for privacy, all of our code for private transactions, everything that we did, several years worth of R&D, millions of dollars of R&D, we didn't just make open source, we've made public domain. We renounced ownership, we gave it to the blockchain community. And I would say now, I feel like we're starting to get a little bit more kind of credibility especially in the Ethereum community as a serious participant that will not only build a business, but is going to actually contribute to the ecosystem growth and opportunity space.
So on that, just a quick segue, but again, for the large, maybe 3,000 to 5,000 and probably close to 100 universities watching right now, and the 19 to 23-year-olds, CS majors, data scientists, lawyers that are interested in blockchain, of the code you made open source, public domain, if you were a student today, how would you encourage them to utilize that and innovate around it? What would you say the opportunities are?
What I would say, so the tools that we've made available are the key tools required to do secure private transactions on public blockchains. So if you go and Google like a Nightfall or Nightlight, that's our library of tools for private transactions. If you go and look for something called the Baseline Protocol, that's the tools that we developed with Microsoft and Consensus around how to do kind of a full set of end-to-end transactions, including things like business agreements and that mix notarization with tokenization and other services. So what I would say is if you want companies to use the technology that you're developing, you need to build it from the ground up in a way that's aware of how privacy works. And unfortunately, one of the things that's really tough about this is zero knowledge proofs are not easy. They are hard. They're not impossible by any means, but they're hard. And you really need to take time to kind of understand those. If you're a developer, you need to take time to understand those. One of the reasons why a lot of other companies haven't built public blockchain solutions is it's too difficult. It's not a simple thing. Now, I think we have simplified things a lot with our toolkit. We've created the systems and the infrastructure that makes that possible, but it's not as easy as just pounding out some if this then that type of code in Solidity. You really have to understand the implications of regulatory compliance. You have to think through what it means to something inside of a shield contract. It's not a completely straightforward matter, but it's worth your time and investment, right? That would be what I would say. If you care about doing stuff for the enterprise, then you need to think carefully about what it means to do things with privacy and security. And you need to think about what the value proposition is. Ask yourself this question: could what I'm planning to do be done on a website? There's a million things that you could do. One of the phrases that we had to use a lot early on at our time, my time at EY, people would come to me like, I want to do this, I want to do that on blockchain. And one of the things I would ask, or the questions I like to ask a lot is, or phrases we had was, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. One of the things that's very unlikely is, let's say you have something in the enterprise and it works. It doesn't work well, but it kind of works, right? Ripping out the existing solution and replacing it with something on a blockchain just because it might be a little bit better probably is never going to make it high enough on the list of priorities to be funded and done. You got to find something that's really broken and you've got to fix it really well, right? And to do that, don't build this nuclear powered super platform of amazing stuff. Fix one problem very well. I say no to 98, 99% of the stuff that comes across my desk in terms of things that we could do with blockchain, because we need to do a limited number of things extremely well if we want enterprises to adopt them and to pay money for them.
100%, right? And I would like to kind of play off of that, right? Like, do one thing really well, or what are the real use cases? I think I find people say, or supply chain, I think perfect example. And like, blockchain is a great solution for supply chain, right? And I'm like, okay, then let's dissect it. So what is blockchain? One, it's a signature, right? So it's someone signing for something that you can trust it, and for the variety of processes. And maybe the other half of the best that could get you would be a way you store your data. So you could do it in a very private way on a private chain, or you could go as far as the public side, right? But it's not going to analyze your lab results. It's not going to validate what's in a box, right? Other devices, IoT sensors, RFID chips might do that. But blockchain elementally is not so complicated, right? So I think it's important to really drill down on what are the applications, right? And I find that there is some core infrastructure that companies could put in place that, and I'll take signature, for example. If a company wanted to apply signature or signing in a blockchain for supply chain, or for, let's say, payments or remittance, or for settlements, or maybe they had some consumer integration or experiential marketing campaign or something they wanted to do, where the beer came from a supplier to whatever, they could tell a story from their phone. In each step, you're going to need to do signing, right? So it's like, at least my advice is like, get signing done right once, right? And if you get that process, if you get used to signing things done one time, 85-90% of that experience, whether you're on blockchain X, Y, or Z, is going to be able to be replicated, right? So I guess my question is, in thinking about that, and an hour or two before this call, I was on with Dr. Alex Kahana, as head of Chief Medical Officer at Consensus Health, right? And a little bit biased, he was saying, there's no better blockchain. He's laughing. He says, there's no better application for blockchain other than healthcare, right? We touch supply chain, we touch settlement, we touch regulatory data, etc. So I guess I would ask you, of all the things that people might wish for, of all the things people might hope that blockchain can do, what are the applications that are like the home runs for you? Like, what are the things that you think really make sense? And like, what are your clients asking for? And even if they're asking for it and they might not be what they want, like, what makes sense to you?
So we have a kind of a simple kind of set of metrics that we look at in terms of, whether or not a blockchain technology would be a good fit. Fundamentally, it often really boils down to this. Blockchains are really working most effectively for complex, multi-party business transactions where the parties involved need to share both information and business logic. It's interesting, you talk a lot about signatures. That actually doesn't come up a lot in our discussions in the enterprise. What comes up over and over again is, I have multiple parties in my transaction, right? If I'm a supply chain, whether it's a hospital or a manufacturing environment or an insurance company, I've got a buyer, a seller, a transportation company. maybe a financing entity, perhaps an insurance company. I have many different parties involved in this transaction. And we all have some shared information, right? What is this widget that I bought, right? And who's got it right now? One of the things that's really beautiful about blockchain for supply chain is tokenization, right? If I have a token in my wallet, it cannot also be in your wallet. And by the way, bizarrely, I spent many years in enterprise supply chain. Most enterprise supply chains aren't like that. If you receive into your inventory system in China a bunch of mugs that were made in Vietnam, there's no guarantee that the mugs that were made in Vietnam were taken out of the inventory system there. That's not how corporate systems work because they're not all connected, right? And that's why if you ask most companies, hey, how much inventory you have, they say things like 2 weeks or about $30 million. They don't know, right? Blockchain provides you with this opportunity to be very precise about what you have. But also what happens is, as this mug moves its way from Vietnam onto the ship and into Hong Kong and duty, tariff, tax, and duty are due, and then it's got to go to Shenzhen where it gets put on a retail store. Each time it moves, there's not only does everybody need to know where this mug is, and we need to keep track of this one mug, but we also have some shared business rules, right? And so the value proposition of blockchain is if I have multiple parties, and by multiple, I mean more than two, because if you have only two parties, you really don't need a blockchain. You need to have shared information, right? What is this thing? Where is it going? Who has access to it? Who's got it right now? And you need shared business logic. If this happens, then do this. If the mug enters the port of Hong Kong, then pay this import duty and change the status of the ownership to the mug, and then pay the buyer, and then move it to Shenzhen, right? So those are the characteristics. Now, I love supply chain because I spent a lot of years in supply chain and I really understand it. Healthcare is a fabulous one. I think the big challenge with healthcare is the same one with finance, which is it's very heavily regulated. And so sometimes regulations are overly specific. Not only do they say what you need to do, they sometimes say how you need to do it. And sometimes that how isn't compatible with the technology. If the how is interpreted as you must document and somebody says, well, that means paper, you need to take the time to actually get somebody to figure out how to deal with this move from paper documentation to a notarization or timestamp on the blockchain. But the bottom line for us comes back.
A signature. It always tends to come back. Even if you move that mug, when it comes off the boat, even if there's an RFID chip on it, there's an RFID reader that picks it up, and that unit should sign the transaction, right? So we end with these constant signatures, right? And how do we add new devices? How do we add new layers of trust, right, throughout that process?
Maybe, it's interesting. We just don't really talk much about signatures. That doesn't seem to be the issue, right? The signature may be the outcome, but the issue is, do you have multiple parties? Do you need to have shared business logic? And how will you get that data? And by the way, what will you do in an immutable system when the butterfingered stevedore in Hong Kong drops your mug and shatters it, right? Now we have to figure out how to burn that token. So, those are the kinds of questions that enterprise ask, which is in an imperfect world, almost everything that we really want to do with blockchain relies upon an interface with the real world, with human beings, with machines, with sensors that are not perfect. If all you and I are doing is moving Bitcoin, the Bitcoins never really get lost, right? We know where every single Bitcoin that ever was is. That's not true with mugs or glasses or cars, right? They disappear, they get stolen, they get accidentally dropped off the side of the boat. Crazy stuff happens to stuff in the real world. And almost everything that we're going to do in the future depends on us figuring out how to manage the real world interactions off-chain to on-chain. And with that, I'm afraid I'm actually running out of time for today's discussion.
No, I love this discussion. I'm happy just to have the minutes that I got. So, Paul, it was very nice to talk to you, by the way. As I mentioned earlier, there's a few conversations we're having next week, panels, a few companies, and for everybody listening, I will say, listen to this guy. I thought I knew a bit about enterprise today and what they were looking for, and I just learned a few lessons. So before you go, Paul, again, I really want to take a moment for the students probably that are on this call. Any last words and advice for them?
Maybe sort of two things. Number one, please go visit blockchain.ey.com. You can find all of our stuff there, open source stuff, closed source stuff, product services, including our blockchain security service, which is free. And then number two, it's great that you have programming. It's great that you have statistics. I'm a huge fan of people with engineering skills, but I really also encourage people to take history classes, because over and over again, I see case after case where what really inspires me and helps me think through situations is looking back at what happened in the Industrial Revolution. What happened when the car first came on the scene? What happened? How did people buy the first mainframes? History is full of lessons. And even though it doesn't repeat itself perfectly, it tells us so much about how technology is adopted, how the business cycle operates, the kind of things that go on. So if you're lucky enough, as I did, to go to one of these liberal arts universities where you can do all kinds of different stuff, make sure you throw in some history and maybe a side of statistics.
You guys heard it. I'm telling you, I talk to enough people to tell you if someone has like a really good perspective or not. This guy is smart. So
flattery will get you anything.
Yeah. And hey, I don't have to flatter you after the interview. That was only in the preamble. But Paul, I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate you making time. For anybody listening, I hope you enjoyed it, and we will continue this conference over the next few days. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Good to see you, Paul.
You're tuned in to Reimagine 2020. Stay tuned to learn more about the state-of-the-art in blockchain education and technological development all around the world. Reimagine 2020.